kindred. My name is Tabby, and one of my favorite hobbies is knitting. So I'm going to show you a finished object that I made in 2024, but I also wanted to share something you can do while cuddling under my finished object. So my finished object is this blanket, but I also wanted to share some book recommendations for those who might have set it like a reading goal for 2025, or it's just something you can do while cuddling under a nice cozy blanket. So this is a square blanket. It's actually turned out bigger than I thought it would, but I knit it completely out of scraps. And so pretty much it's a lapghan, or a lap afghan, whatever you call it, a lap blanket. So if you hold it in a certain way, it reminds me of like the god eyes that people used to make in the 70s. But the pattern is the giant square scrap blanket. So basically what you do is you start in the middle. This is a fingering weight project. You start in the middle and you knit out until you're happy with the size. I think I made mine, gosh, it might be 40 by 40. But I knitted it on like a size 2 or 3 needle. I chose to do an I-cord bind off because stocking knit tends to roll, and I was hoping that the I-cord bind off would stop it rolling. But I did wind up steaming it with an iron to get it to lay a little bit flatter because the stocking knit wanted to roll. But yeah, I think I started this project in 2021. So I think it took me a couple of years. Not much to say about it other than it's pretty. It reminds me of a God's eye, and yeah, it's fairly warm for a fingering blanket. So one of my other hobbies I like to do while cuddling under a nice handmade blanket or store-bought blanket is reading. So I thought I'd share some reading recommendations with you, some of my favorite stories. Now, if you're looking for smutty stories, this is not the book recommendation for you, so maybe click away, because all these are clean. I don't enjoy smut, so I will not be sharing any of that recommendations. I'm just going to go through a couple different categories. Let me look at my list here and put the timestamps so if you want to skip around. So I'm going to start with some of my just general favorites, and then I'm going to share some retellings, and then I will share some mysteries, and then just generally some good series, and that's it. So let's get started with some of my general favorites. I think we'll do some like children's grade novels first. So one of my favorite stories that I've read from childhood that I've really enjoyed is called Surviving the Applewhites. And this is by Stephanie S. Tolan. So this is the story of a young man who has been kicked out of a couple different schools. And he's living with his grandfather, and his grandfather doesn't want anything to do with him anymore. So he sends the young man, his name is Jake, to this family that lives kind of out in the boonies. They're kind of like free spirits. They're homeschoolers, so they're going to homeschool Jake with the rest of their family. He's kind of like a project to this family. They've got I think it's a patriarch. I think the grandfather is a patriarch, but there's several different branches of this family that live on this, I think it's called What's In, this farm. So there's the director's family, his brother makes furniture. I think the director is the only one that has kids, but there's a grandfather that makes furniture. I think there's a brother that makes furniture. I think there's maybe 2 different married couples, and one of them has kids and one of them doesn't. It's been a little bit since I read this book, but I really enjoy it. So it's about him beginning to learn who he is and what he wants to do. The father, who's the director, puts on a play, which is The Sound of Music, and so it's kind of one of those hijinks stories of this family is kind of a little bit accident prone, but it's just kind of a hilarious story of this kid who's a fish out of water in this crazy eccentric family scenario, and how he learns and adapts and becomes a decent person rather than the kind of miscreant that he had been. So if you're into hilarious kind of happening story, a comedy of errors about middle schoolers, then this is a good story for you. My next, just dropped the whole pile of books, Tabby, it's fine. My next middle school novel is actually kind of a survival story, I guess. It's called Holes, and it's about a young man who gets sent to this camp. So it's a little bit of like his experience at this camp, which is not a very good, fun experience. He essentially is a juvenile delinquent, caught stealing a pair of shoes, and gets sent to this camp as kind of like probation. So it's about his experience at the camp and the friends that he makes at the camp, and just kind of general his experience at the camp. And then there's people who used to live in this area in the past woven in with his story. His name is Stanley, so Stanley's story, and then a story of the people who used to live in that town, which is now like I don't know if it's a ghost town or just deserted, or in the surrounding area. So it's a really good story. I don't know if it's heartwarming, but they did also make a movie out of it, and I feel like the book is probably better than the movie, as generally is the case. I don't know why I like this book. It's just a good read. It's a fun story, even though it's kind of depressing for Stanley, and it's a little bit of a survival story. But yeah, another good tale. So the next middle school novel, children's story I'm going to recommend is called The Invention of Hugo Cabret, I believe is how you pronounce it. And this is by Brian Selznick, and Brian Selznick has written a few stories like this style. What's really different about Brian Selznick is that he writes prose, but he also draws pictures. So it's a mix of the two, and he has a really beautiful art style. This book happens to be my favorite of his. I haven't read Big Tree yet, so I don't know if Big Tree's any good. But Hugo Cabret is a story of another boy. So he is a young boy living in Paris, and he's living on his own. So it's his story of him and how he keeps, I think it's the clocks alive in this Paris train station. And he meets this girl, and it's kind of a little bit of a mystery. Her grandfather is a little bit mysterious. So it's the story of him finding out this kind of mystery in Paris. But I think it's the best of his story. They did make a movie out of this. I think it's just called Hugo. The book is better, in my opinion. I'd rather read a visually stunning book than watch a visually stunning movie, which might sound a little weird. It's just kind of a charming story. There's a little bit of a whimsy to the mystery, and there's a little bit of a whimsy between his writing and his art style. So it's a very thick book, but because some of it is art, it's actually a fairly quick read. So yeah, if you're into like early Hollywood movies at all, you're into more like a whimsical story, I would recommend this for you. If you're just an adult who likes children's books, it's a good read. Actually, any of the 3 books, if you're an adult who likes children's books, those are good reads. So the next 2 children's book recommendations I have are more classics. Those were published more like the last 20 years, and these were published way before that. So these are two childhood girl stories. If you want to read a book about just the joy of childhood and growing up and just a beautiful girlhood, I definitely recommend these 2 stories. If you haven't by chance read Anne of Green Gables, what are you doing? Stop and read it. It is a beautiful story of a girl who has a vivid imagination and just knows how to make people's lives a little bit brighter. And it's beautiful descriptions of Prince Edward Island. It is a whole series, so Lucy Maud Montgomery did write a series of books. I'm recommending Anne of Green Gables because it's the one that's the most iconic and fresh in my memory. I think the whole series is worth reading, but the one that I remember the most and is dearest to my heart is definitely the beginning book. Anne is an orphan. She goes to live with a spinster and her brother. So a bachelor and spinster, they have no business raising this young girl, but she worms her way into the hearts of them, and just it's a delightful story. Yeah, Anne's a classic. Read it. I'm not sure how many people have heard of Daddy Longlegs, but Daddy Longlegs by Jean Webster is also another classic. It's about another orphan. Her name is Drusilla. And Jerusalem who goes by Judy, gets sent to college by a mysterious benefactor. So she goes from an orphanage to being sent to a girls' college, and it's basically her letters to her benefactor thanking her for sending her to college and just her college experience as a young woman in, like, I think it's Victorian or Edwardian time frames. But it's a cute little story, and at the end she begins to realize who her benefactor is. So it's kind of a little bit of a romance, but it's mostly just a girlhood story of her learning all about college life, the things she's missed out on, living in an orphanage. They actually did, I think, adapt this book in several different movies, and I don't think any of them are good. I would just recommend reading this book, and actually its sequel, Dear Enemy, is pretty funny too, entertaining. Dear Enemy may actually be more entertaining than Daddy Longlegs. I feel like it has more of that comedic mishap that, like, Surviving the Applewhites has. I definitely recommend both of them by Jean Webster. They're just very, like, wholesome girlhood stories that has a little bit of a romance. They're kind of, like, Anna's an outspoken heroine. I feel like Judy and, I forget who's the heroine in Dear Enemy. I feel like the three of them are all, like, a little bit feisty, outspoken heroines that, I don't know, just brighten up the world within their, like, community. So definitely recommend these if you're into girlhood stories, if you're into, I think both of them have a little bit of romance. So yeah, if that's your jam, you're just into wholesome girlhood stories, I would check these out if you haven't already. So my next recommendation is, I didn't know this was a book until they made the movie. So this is my controversial opinion. I like the book and the movie kind of equally on this one, which is strange because usually I like the book a lot better than the movie. But occasionally I'll take a look at those lists of, like, movies that are coming out in 2025 that are based on books and go read the book. So that was what happened with Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris. So this book is Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris and Mrs. Harris Goes to New York. I recommend both of them. It's pretty much, how to describe this? It is about a woman who has a dream and works hard to make that dream happen. It's pretty much what it is in a nutshell. Mrs. Harris is a charwoman, so a cleaning lady who lives, I believe, in London, who has a big dream to go to Paris and buy an expensive dress. So that's what the first book is about, and the second book is she goes to New York, I think, with a family. It's been a year maybe since I read it, but they're both really charming and whimsical stories, and it's just that determination that she worked so hard to make a dream happen really spoke to me. The movie takes some liberties and it has a little bit of a different ending than the book does, but I think they're both really good stories. And I've always wanted to travel, so that was where it touched me. I'm like, I really want to make this happen, and to do that, I have to work hard and have that dream that she does. So yeah, definitely, I think it's a fun story. If you're into, like, fashion or traveling or just some stories that are classic, I think this is set in the 50s because it's Dior that she goes to buy a dress from. But it's just kind of a cute, heartwarming tale. So if you're into that, then this might be the book for you. So one of the books I read for the first time in 2024 and really fell in love with is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. And there's a couple of reasons I really like this book and I will recommend it. It's like Anne of Green Gables, beautiful in the description. It really talks about the house, Manderley, the kinds of flowers. So the setting of the story, I think, is Cornwall. It really talks about that. And just kind of this love of botany, I guess, is really pretty in the story. If that makes any sense, probably not. But also it's a love letter to jealousy. So the story is this young woman is a companion. She meets this handsome guy who's quite a bit her senior on this trip. Her companion life sucks. She doesn't really have any other vacation opportunities. And she falls in love with this handsome older man who then marries her and takes her back to his family home of Manderley. And he has been previously married, and so the title character Rebecca is his previous wife. The young woman who's a companion is never named. She's just the second Mrs. Winter. And I think that's a little bit of a genius on Daphne du Maurier's part. It was like, his first wife is so present in his life at Manderley that there is no room for his second wife. And so she just has this presence, which is kind of spooky. So it's a little bit of a thriller, I think, in some ways. I wouldn't recommend it to a younger person. I definitely think it's an adult book. Not that it's like super explicit or like really spooky, but there's just that element of thriller, which I think Alfred Hitchcock kind of latched onto, and he made his movie. I haven't seen that version. I've seen the one with Armie Hammer, and I actually really like that movie too. I think I watched the movie before I read the book. The book is fairly short. I think it's more of a novelette than a novel, but I think it's worth a read because to me it's like, yeah, I get how the second Mrs. Winter thinks and feels. Like, I'm an overthinker, and I'm like, I so understand how she jumps to her conclusions. So I just think it's a really good story. It's a little bit of a thriller. Again, there's a little bit of a mystery at the end. There's a little bit of a twist. Yeah. So my favorite book of 2024, if you're into thrillers or, again, more classic novels set in the past with beautiful floral descriptions, and or you're just like, I want to know what a love letter to jealousy reads like, take a crack at it. I recommend it. And then my last in the favorites category is Myrtle. If you like logic puzzles at all, if you enjoy Clue, this is the book for you. So there's actually 3 versions of this. This is one, and they do tell a little bit of a story, so I recommend starting with one. But if you're into, and they start off easy and then they move to difficult. You get clues, you get suspects, you get locations. I think there's weapons, and they give you like hints to figure it out. But it is a little bit of a story. Like, they'll tell you a little synopsis on each puzzle, and then it's just kind of like a linear story that builds to the end. And each book is like that. And then I think like 2 builds on 1 and 3 builds on 2 and 1. So I recommend doing them in sequence. He did actually come out with a Myrtle board game, so if you want to skip the book and you don't want to do things in pencil and you'd rather do logic puzzles with others, maybe consider the board game instead. I really enjoyed it. I like logic puzzles. I like mysteries. So either of those strike your fancy, give Myrtle a shot. I actually picked this up in London when we were traveling. So maybe it's a great thing to do while you're like on the plane, taking a car trip, in the doctor's waiting room. Like, I think this is just in the coffee shop. Great thing to have with you for something to do in those situations, or you just want to keep your brain sharp. You want to, maybe challenge your friends to do something logical. So yeah, if you're a puzzles person, whether it's like logic, word search, whatever, then this might be a good book for you. So my next category is retellings, and my first recommendation is a kind of loose fantasy retelling, and this is going in retellings rather than series because I don't think I cared for all the books in this series. But this is called The Tales of the Dark Forest, and the first one is Nightmare. So this is more of a loose retelling of a bunch of different fairy tales combined. So the first one is about Will and Rose, and Will wants to become a knight, and so that's why it's called Nightmare. But they're kind of, I would probably say, elementary grade school novels. They're fun, they're humorous. I would say they're probably the ones that actually originally did the funny chapter titles instead of Rick Riordan. Like Dreaming of Spiders and Scheming Liars and Things That Go Pop in a Fight. I think there's one that was like, where there's a will, there's a way, and they rose to the occasion. But they're just fun, humorous retellings of, like, I think Rose is Little Red Riding Hood. Just kind of a smorgasbord of, like, fairy tale characters in one book. So my favorites of the series were Nightmare, which is the first book, Wizard, which is the second book, And then, actually I got that all wrong. Good Night is the first book, which I liked. And then Nightmare is actually book 4. But Wizard is book 2, so maybe you can read the whole series, but I think there's one called Trollology, which I wasn't really a big fan of. That was probably book 3 if I had to guess. Really punny, funny retelling of fairy tales, general characters from different fairy tales. But yeah, kind of brainless, fun for a younger age group, but I still think it's worth reading as an adult. Okay, my next retelling recommendation is another thick book, and this one's actually thick because it's thick. East by Edith Pattou is a retelling of East of the Moon, West of the Sun, which is, I believe, like a Scandinavian or maybe Nordic fairy tale, which is kind of like Beauty and the Beast, where this girl goes to live with a polar bear. But it's also like Eros and Psyche, where she discovers he's not what he seems to be, and then she has to go rescue him. But it's a really good retelling of that original fairy tale. So the fairy tale is really short, I think. So our main character is Rose, and her mom is a little bit superstitious about like when her kids were born, which direction they're facing. So it's very much an enriched tale from the original fairy tale of like how that superstition plays into like Rose's future journey with this polar bear. So I really enjoyed it. I think it's a lush retelling of this fairy tale. Very much like one of those kind of strong heroine stories where she has to go rescue her prince. So if you're into that, or you're just into like a wintry tale, or you're into like Beauty and the Beast retellings at all, this might strike your fancy. Yeah, I think, yes, it's one of those stories where it has multiple points of view, and I think it's really well done. So you switch from like Rose to her brother to the Troll Queen, and you get their different points of view of the story. So I like those kinds of books if they're done well, and I think East is done well. So another retelling series that I really enjoyed, which is a little bit strange for me because I'm not big into science fiction, is called System Divine. And I can never remember the titles of the 3 books, but it's a trilogy of science fiction that is a retelling of Les Mis. I think it's really well done. While they're thick books, they're really easy to read through. So the way that I think it's 2 women. The way that these women translated the French Revolution into this science fiction futuristic world is fantastic. I think it's really good. I really enjoyed it. If you're into science fiction at all, if you're into Les Mis, if you're just into retellings, I think it's a good series. It's again another story with a couple different viewpoints. You have 3 different viewpoints that you're following. You have the viewpoint of the character that's Cosette. Her love interest, is it Marcus or Marcellus? And then Eponine, and it's really well like written from their 3 viewpoints, and they're completely different people and how they were raised, how they function. So I think it's a really good retelling from their viewpoints, and they're just so different in this world setting, and that I think these authors did a really good job of setting up of like this dystopian science fiction futuristic world, and these 3 different characters that are totally different with different backgrounds and how they come together and just kind of have their own revolution. So like the revolution aspect is still very much in there, but it's just science fiction. It's different, it's good. Another science fiction series that I enjoyed the retelling of is Lunar Chronicles, which I think most people have read, but it takes, I think it's been a couple years since I read it, but I think it's Cinderella is the first book, Cinder, and then Rapunzel is Crest, and then Scarlet is Red Riding Hood, and then is it Winter? Is Snow White. So again, very good world building of a futuristic sci-fi kind of dystopian world. This one has more of like magic powers which come from the moon. So you got the people on the moon, you got the people on Earth. but like really well-rounded, fleshed out characters, which I think are true of both series. Both the Lunar Chronicles and the System Divine, I think, have really good fleshed out characters with motive and agendas that they need to go through, and both are kind of a little bit like have revolution in them. One is just a retelling of French revolutionary literature, and one is a retelling of like fantasy, fairy tale literature. And I feel like as far as like uncomfortableness and grit and like the situations, like Lunar Chronicles gets a little more darker than System Divine. But if you're into retellings at all, whether it's science fiction or fantasy, I think both series are really worth reading. Don't make the mistake that I did, where I read pretty much the majority of the Lunar Chronicles, except for I did not start with Cinder because I was so over... like Cinderella retellings that I read the rest of the series first. I think Crest is my favorite out of the three, or the four books, which is the Rapunzel retelling. Like, Crest is such a cute character. And they did a really good retelling of like their original fairy tale. That I did not read Cinder, and I read the other books, and then years later I went back and listened to Cinder, which really did not work. So if you're gonna start with a series, read the first book and then proceed. Don't do what I did. And then actually my last retelling recommendation is 2 graphic novels. So the first one is called Rapunzel's Revenge, and I believe it's by Shannon Hale. I forget who the illustrator is. And the second one that follows that up is called Calamity Jack, and that's also by Shannon Hale, so it's like a series. But Rapunzel's Revenge is a fun retelling because A, it's a graphic novel, and B, it's set in the Old West. And again, it's very much like one of those, she doesn't need rescuing situations. So it's again one of those like strong heroine stories, like she uses her braids as whips. It's set in the Wild West. She meets up with Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk, so that's what Calamity Jack is about, is his story of the Beanstalk and then how he meets up with Rapunzel. So it's a fun story. It's like a fairy tale set in the Old West, so you've got the magical elements of like Mother Gothel, and she's like growing things, so there's like some swamp magic to it, I think. But it's just like fun and different because it's a graphic novel and it's set in the Old West. And so if you're into graphic novels, if you're into the Old West, if you're into fairy tale retelling set in the Old West, then Rapunzel's Revenge is definitely for you. So I'm going to be moving on to mystery recommendations now, and mysteries are one of the categories or genres that's really close to my heart, and so I grew up with Sherlock Holmes. If you haven't read Sherlock Holmes at all, I would definitely recommend any of the Sherlock Holmes, either short stories or full novels. I think they're really good, atmospheric, Victorian detective. If you're into great detectives at all, I think you should give Sherlock Holmes a go. Again, I think you could start anywhere, whether it's the short story anthologies or like the full-length novels. I've been to the Sherlock Holmes Museum in London. It was really cool. I'm a nerd. Yeah. And then if you're looking for like a really good true to books adaptation of his books, I would go with the Granada Sherlock Holmes with Jeremy Brent. That I feel like is the most true and accurate to the books TV series there is. I haven't seen Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch, so I don't have any opinions on that, but if you really want like a true Victorian detective series, go for the Granada Sherlock Holmes. Jeremy Brent is amazing, even though his health kind of fails later on in the series. One of the standalone books that's not really a standalone that I would recommend is Murder Best Advertised by, I think it's Dorothy Sawyer's. So I think it's Dorothy Sawyer's Lord Peter Wimsey. But the reason I really like it is because it's kind of fun. It's a, someone at an advertising firm has been murdered. And so Lord Peter Wimsey has to go undercover in an advertising slogan campaign office, which I think this is in the 1920s or 1930s. So he's got to write like slogans for products, like advertising products, But while he's doing that, he's also got to figure out like who's responsible for the death of this like employee slash coworker, and just the peak, pulling back the curtain of like how advertisements got written was so interesting. So that's why I recommend Murder Mass Advertise against maybe some other Lord Peter Wimsey books. Some of them are like really intense. Like the bell one is really intense about how like you ring bells and all that. It's really kind of long and boring. It's fascinating, but it's also kind of boring. So if you're gonna read any of the Lord Peter Wimseys, I recommend Murder Must Advertise because it's kind of a fun one. So if you notice, the mysteries that I mentioned previously are more classical Golden Age mysteries. The next couple of mysteries I'm going to recommend are more recent. So the first one is Murder Your Employer, and this is by Rupert Holmes, who actually wrote Escape, the Pina Colada song. So this is kind of a fun mystery, if I can use that term. So it is about a young man who greatly loathes his employer for a couple different reasons. So he's our main hero or protagonist. He kind of gets unexpectedly picked up and sent to this school, which is basically called the McMaster's Conservatory. But it's basically a school of how to train people to murder people and get away with it. Like super like, it's almost like Spy meets Murder. Like you do it in a certain way so that no one ever catches on to the fact that this person was murdered. It looks like, you know, it was natural or whatever. So it follows him, it follows another woman who wants to murder her employer, and there's like a code of like why you want to murder your employer, and if it benefits everyone and it doesn't harm anyone, you can go ahead and do it. I think there's like a kind of surprising twist at the end of like how they pull the different murders off, because there's three protagonists, two of which are female, and one of them is the male that I already mentioned. So it's Cliff Iverson, Gemma, and Dora, and this is like, I think, set in the maybe the 50s, the golden age of Hollywood, because Dora is a actress. So it's kind of a fun, atmospheric read. Yeah, so I just enjoyed it. I think it was a fun read. Is it the best mystery ever? No, but it's not also the worst mystery ever. I think it's fairly clean. And the fact that there's like, it's not really graphic. So there's not like a bunch of blood everywhere and like bone, and yeah, it's not graphic like that. I feel like there's a few like maybe sexual kind of overtones or maybe even innuendos, but it's pretty much like a clean kind of cozy read. But I also just like the atmosphere of a school. The school is pretty cool. So if you like mysteries or dark academia, if either of those kind of like pique your interest, I think you would enjoy this mystery. So the next mysteries I have to recommend is actually kind of a series, but I've only read the first two, I think. It's called Lillian Frost and Edith Head by Renee Patrick. The first one is called Design for Dying. So it is about Edith Head. If you're not familiar with Edith Head, she was a costume designer in the age of Golden Hollywood. Worked on a lot of different movies, costumed a lot of different famous stars. I think this series like mentions a few different actors, like Bob Hope is mentioned, maybe even Bing Crosby, like people she worked with in real life are mentioned in this series. So the fictional part is that Lillian Frost is a made-up character. She and Edith Head kind of somehow meet, and they solve different mysteries that have to do with different people within that golden age of Hollywood. So if you're like a Hollywood film buff, like Golden Age, or just an Edith Head fan, or you enjoy mysteries, I think any of those, this series would tickle your fancy. But if you're like a film nerd and you grew up on old movies like I did, and seeing these different actors mentioned, like I think Dorothy Lamour, Bob Hope, it's really kind of a fun read. And if you're just like a fan of that classic golden era time frame, another good recommendation for you. Okay, so I don't want this video to be super long, so I'm just going to share two of my favorite series, or series I think you should be checking out. So one of them I think is more well known. It is the Thief series. What is it called actually? Is it the Thief or is it something else? But it's by Megan Will and Turner. So it starts off with a thief, and it's about a young man named Gin, G-E-N, is that Gin? And he's out to steal this item. But this series is really good and it's really well written, but it's like a political intrigue series, which actually I'm really not into, but like this is the only series that I like the politics and political intrigue of this series. So it's fantasy, but it kind of feels like Greek or Roman myths, but it's kind of set in its own world, different gods, different pantheon, and there's these different nations that are kind of battling each other out. So that's the political intrigue part, is like each nation, like the Queen of Atola versus, Queen of Edith, maybe. Yeah, so Glenn is from Edith, and he crosses paths in the series with the Queen of Atola, and there's a little bit of a romance the further you get along in the series. The first book is not romance at all, I feel like, but they're great characters. Like the thief I love, and then the two, like Useless 1 and Useless 2, there's some humor in it. There's just this sense of humor. It shifts different characters through the different books. So the first book starts out with the thief again, and then it goes to like the Queen of Atola, Costas, as in the King of Atola. He's one of the guards. So there's a lot of good like twists and turns later on in the series. I think the closer you get to the more recent release books, they're not as good as the original books. I feel like the last two books were kind of like iffy. They're not the best, but the series really starts out strong. I think the first three books are definitely worth a read. They're really enjoyable. I highly recommend them. I feel like they're known, but not super well known. So yeah, give it a try if you like fantasy, I feel like he's sarcastic. If you like this sarcastic, witty thief, and then a little bit of like maybe a slow burn romance later on, check it out. Or just fantasy. If you're a fantasy fan, like this is it. The last series I want to recommend is called Timeless, and it is time traveling. It's a Christian book. So if you're not particularly religious or don't have strong beliefs, maybe it's not for you. But I really enjoyed it. This is not the first book. This is actually book 3. I bought the rest on Kindle and then accidentally bought this one in paper. So that's the deal. But it is about a family, and all the books so far have been about girls. I believe there's a new book coming out later this year or next that has a male protagonist. But the story is, these girls are all born with a gift. So they have two different paths in life. So one path is in one time period, and then the other path is in a different time period. For example, this book, the twins, Hope and Grace, they have the ability to time cross between 1692 Salem, Massachusetts, and 1912 New York City. So when they go to sleep and say like Salem, they'll wake up in New York. So they're both kind of fly planes in the 1912 time frame. And then Salem is in the middle of like the Salem witch trials, which wasn't my favorite point in history, but these books are fascinating to read. Like specifically this one, it was a page turner. I was like, how is this gonna end? What happens with the girls? So the deal with their time crossing is they have to make a choice between the two paths. So like say Hope wanted to stay in 1912 on her 21st birthday, she has to stay up past midnight, and that's the path she stays in. The other path, she falls asleep. So the first book, I think, is about Libby. I think the main character's name is Libby, and she had two different time periods to choose between. And then there's always like a twist at the end, I feel like. Like Gabriella sets up this world, builds it, and then with each book and each heroine, they have a twist on their gift, or they have something they struggle with. The heroine in the second book actually had 3 different paths to choose from. One of the twins struggles with, like, is this a gift or a curse? The 4th book, which just came out this year, actually veers off from this section of the family. So it goes like Libby, her daughter Maggie, and then the twins. And then it veers off into their cousin who you meet in this book. She has a daughter. So that 4th book is actually about her daughter. And then I think book 5 goes back to Hope and Grace's kids. So I just really enjoy it. I enjoy history. So if you like history, or maybe like time travel, if you're looking for good Christian fiction, this is it. If you're looking for heroines that are conflicted, they're not perfect, they have guilt sometimes they have hard choices to make, sometimes they struggle with, why is this happening to me? There's also always a romance element, and there's some kind of like romance that compounds their choice between like 2 paths that they're staying in. So if you also just want clean romance, this is a good choice too. I want to spread the word about this series. I feel like more people should be reading it. So go check it out. If that all sounds like your jam, thank you for watching. Thank you for watching this video. If you check out any of the books I recommended, or you've read any of the books I recommended, let me know. I love to talk about books, even though sometimes I feel like I don't know how to talk about books. Books are so enjoyable. Or if you like any of the picture books on my t-shirt, let me know that too. So I hope you have some enjoyable reads in 2025, and yeah, stick around if you want to see more knitting, fashion, and bookish content. But that's all for me for now, so have a great rest of your day.